Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Christopher Bedford. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews. Hundreds of American lives were wiped out in a matter of days by Hurricane Helene. Parts of the U.S., sometimes referred to derisively as flyover country, lost incredible numbers of people. Towns were wiped out. The magnitude of the destruction is nearly apocalyptic. Thousands and thousands of people were left trapped, without power, without basic necessities. We're getting closer now to understanding the full scope of the disaster, but it's still tragically unclear. The suffering continues. We do not know how many lives the storm will claim when the debris is finally cleared, and the project of rebuilding begins. This is at least the deadliest storm since Hurricane Katrina. It could potentially prove to be even deadlier. We simply don't know yet. We also don't yet fully know how to assess the federal government's preparedness or the federal government's culpability. As I spent really the last week or two trying to understand what happened and why, my friend Christopher Bedford made an interesting point, and I wanted to press him on it a little bit. Take a listen.
It kind of reminds me of that Kanye West quote back in the day with Hurricane Katrina, an incredibly deadly hurricane by modern standards, which might actually be eclipsed when you end up going through these mudslides. Kanye West, maybe in an early sign of mental illness, went out there and said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. Well, this administration, whether you're in Ohio, a town that got blown off the map by a train, or whether you're in Appalachia, really needs to show that it cares about white people.
Chris has been overseeing on-the-ground coverage from his reporters over at The Blaze. While we're used to hurricanes by their very nature, of course, ravaging coastal areas, often where journalists and politicians live and vacation, Helene did something different. It went inland, where floods and landslides have wreaked havoc, especially through the Appalachian Mountains. Is something deeply cynical happening in Appalachia right now? In the same way Kanye West once argued disproportionately white and affluent elites didn't care about poor Black Americans devastated by Katrina, Helene is certainly being covered by the major networks and papers, but even now, as I record this, and the dead are being recovered, the story has fallen well below the fold, so to speak, of the New York Times homepage. And that seems very, very wrong. Joining us now to discuss all of this is Christopher Bedford, senior politics editor at The Blaze, where he writes a truly indispensable newsletter. I can't recommend it enough. Chris, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I wish, Chris, that we had been able to have this conversation under better circumstances, but unfortunately, the tragedy continues to unfold across Appalachia. And just kind of wanted to get your reaction as somebody who's been in DC media for a long time to how you've seen Capitol Hill and how you've seen actually the journalism industry respond to what's transpired so far.
I think it's been slow. It's been embarrassingly slow. The hurricane wasn't really on people's radars. People were wondering about rain, essentially. And the nature of this disaster, how isolated it is, and the fact that there's so many mudslides. Right now, Blaze has 3 reporters and Glenn Beck are all down there. I've been talking to a friend who's very high up in FEMA at the same time. They've been reporting back on some really terrifying things. And, the death toll just reached about 200 this morning. Unfortunately, that's going to skyrocket. Like, that number is going to explode. There are towns that are gone. There are 1,000 missing people or more right now. Bodies in trees, bodies in cars, bodies in homes, bodies in canyons and ravines. The landscape has been so remade that the federal government is using military vehicles to try to get around it. You see horses and donkeys going over mountains. Through his charity, Glenn has hired 50 helicopter pilots to join the 50 pilots of the Cajun Air Force, and they're just going around trying to get around red tape and local officials who've been extremely unhelpful by every measure and every account. I'm sure there are great ones doing a phenomenal job, but I've never heard this many complaints about local policemen and their response since Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans police fled and city government failed and state government failed. So this is not nearly over, and sometimes sometimes there's a slowness, or sometimes people blame the federal government unfairly. And I understand that the guys who are down there with FEMA, friends of mine who I've been talking to down there, they have handled every single major disaster in America for 20 years. They've been everywhere. They've held the bodies. They've buried people. They've gone weeks with 2 hours of sleep a night. So these are also hardworking types, most of them, doing good stuff. But with Katrina, George Bush was unfairly blamed. It was a breakdown in New Orleans. It was a breakdown in the state level. Mary Langer on there saying that she had to be in control of the National Guard if they were going to be deployed. There was all these different breakdowns before the federal government. But the scandal of the low payments to families who are already on public assistance that are dwarfed by the payments that are being made to illegal immigrants, and the fact that Mayorkas is coming out and saying that DHS doesn't have the money because it's all been spent on the migrants. Well, that's a serious issue.
I want to actually pause on that point because, there are natural disasters that can obviously occur at periods in American history when the government is at its most efficient and most competent and still be incredibly tragic. And you always have to sort of disentangle the variables to figure out what the case is. And in this case, we look at budget figures that have been presented to us about where FEMA has spent millions and millions, close to $1 billion in the last year, on migrant programs, taking care of the mass influx of humanitarian crisis, the mass influx of migrants who have entered different parts of the United States over the course of the last couple of years. But they're now saying they don't have the budget to make it through this hurricane season. So, Chris, is there something legitimate that we can read into that? It speaks to a serious problem with our government that is having material consequences on people in Appalachia right now.
Yeah. I mean, this sort of thing started out being reported on at Blaze and Daily Caller and Federalist and dismissed as a conspiracy theory, that this rising feeling that people from foreign countries here illegally were taking precedence over American citizens and American veterans and American homeless and American school children. And story after story was starting to pop up from New York or Massachusetts or Texas or Chicago about children displaced or homeless families displaced, hotels taken over. And you started to get this feeling like, maybe Americans are second class. Maybe a lot of American leadership really does care more about illegal foreign immigrants than they do about Americans. And there's always been a huge amount of pushback on that from the political classes and from the elites and from the press. But now we have it. I mean, FEMA was designed for Americans in need. It's something, hurricanes come. This was a natural disaster that was difficult to predict, but a deadly hurricane that causes mass amounts of damage was not difficult to predict. It happens. And for the resources to be so lacking because they were spent on other people without the American consensus. I mean, I don't think the FEMA having exhausted its resources would be something that would have been known had it not been for the fact that those resources were suddenly needed. And they're not there. And people are correct to feel like they've been completely ripped off. That this was done, just like most matters of migration and trade policy, without the consent of the governed. And people are bullied into saying, how dare you? How dare you be upset about this? There's good reason to be upset about it. This is as stark and clear an example as I can see of Americans taking second place. And that is the cause of this populist outrage. That is why people are sick of Republicans and Democrats. That is why voters are poised right now to put Donald Trump back in office. Because you can call it racist or whatever. It's stupid. This hurricanes affect white Americans, black Americans, Asian Americans, Spanish Americans, whatever. You can call it what you want, but it's impossible to deny it. And this is the clearest example, the most obvious, gripping, and sad example of this that I've seen yet.
Well, let me actually ask about that, because I wanted to continue on this Kanye West parallel. It's such an iconic moment in American politics and American culture, and honestly, American history just of the last 20 years. And something about that point is interesting because he was saying the elite Americans who are not in touch with the sort of Black urban demographic don't understand the plight of Black Americans. And in the case of Katrina, by the way, I think he had a point. And I'm wondering, Chris, to what extent that manifests in government incompetence or in lack of interest, in lack of care until it's too late. So, for example, is it that the government was not prepared for a disaster that would befall the interior of the country, so-called flyover country, because it's just not, they spend most of their time in coastal enclaves, top lawmakers and journalists, for example? Or is this just plain old government incompetence? Like our federal government is bloated, wildly inefficient, and not prepared to help people on the ground, can't do sort of basic things anymore. Is it a combination of both? What's really behind what seems to be a pretty wide-scale government failure?
That's hard to say. I mean, the area that this hit is interesting in that all the ravines and the towns being beneath the mountains make it actually poised to be hit by these floods, but they are 100-year floods. And I think the last major one was like 108 years ago. So there's actually newspaper articles commemorating the 100th anniversary at the time and looking at all the different systems that the U.S. Corps of Engineers has built to try and mitigate flooding in the area. And then one newspaper article asked, could this happen again? And they said, yeah, it could. I mean, whether you're the captain of the Titanic or the levee builders in New Orleans, nothing is unsinkable by nature and God. So they knew it could happen again, but they figured that the death count, which this one may actually eclipse, was probably not going to, weren't going to see that again because of advanced warning systems. But this, it was a folly of man a little bit that this hit anyways. And I don't think that just because people live in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, that if they lived in Appalachia, they would have been more prepared for this. I mean, it's a 100-year flood. And FEMA's there's a difficult spot, too, for when you're coming in from outside. You kind of have to take a back seat a little bit to those locals who really know the terrain and know the area. But even those locals are kind of messed up because the terrain has been so radically changed by the forces of the storm, by the mudslides, by the floods, that roads that you could count on, bridges you could count on, trails you could count on, simply aren't there. And you really need to go by air or go by donkey and horse like we've been seeing. There are reports that I have not been down there yet, but I've heard repeatedly, and you can see them on the internet, of some arrogance from the federal officials and that kind of stuff. I know that a lot of these guys are veterans. I've done this before, but you really, my friend personally and other folks who I know who are down there who work with the federal government have always known to take a back seat in some ways and help direct the resources of locals because they know what they need and they know what's needed better than outsiders. But not everyone from Washington has that point of view. And I do think, though, that this is different. I mean, Katrina exposed such a breakdown of New Orleans, I think, more than a breakdown of George W. Bush, which is why Kanye's comment, I don't think, was fair. And if you read his book, Decision Points, George Bush, who I'm not a big fan of, as you know, described it as the lowest point of his presidency, was being accused of this being a personal thing or a racial animus. He said it was the worst he felt, which is shocking considering how many Americans and Iraqis and other people were killed on his watch. But that was his low point. And remember, it was a low point for the country. I was in school at the time. Because there you saw the city knew something was coming. Of course, those people who lived near the levees and lived in the floodable zones, they'd seen a lot of storms come and go. They'd seen the Army Corps of Engineers come and say, we need to get this wall 10 feet higher or we're done. And they say, that levee's going to last. Like, don't worry. It always lasts. Well, this was the time that the levees broke. They didn't last. People had ignored the warnings. People had ignored the buses. People had decided not to leave. And then crime broke out because of if you ever go down to New Orleans, I love that city, but it's a fairly lawless city. It's dangerous. It's violent. The cab drivers will be careful where they drop you off. I've been there. Last time I was there, the bartender told me to take my party and leave before midnight because of the crowd that was going to come in there was going to rob them. And that's what ended up happening. The Superdome, it was violence. It was gang warfare, a settling of grievances. The city police fled. The city mayor fled. The corrupt system of government collapsed. And the Louisiana government wasn't that great either. And then people turned around and said, George Bush, why did you do this? I don't really blame the federal government here, but the stories we're hearing from Appalachia seem like it is personal, repeated, and constant examples of incredible federal mismanagement. And I know there are good people on the ground all around. The Mayorkas running out of money thing is just puts the nail in the coffin. That this is the last thing on people's minds, and the money was not saved to the purposes that it was supposed to be put toward because of the decisions the executive made.
One of my biggest fears, as an American, is that our government is now so bogged down by corruption between special interests and ideological special interests. So it's both ideological and financial, that it's just not able to perform basic duties anymore. We see this. I think Boeing has been a good example. COVID is a good example. There's always going to be some measure of corruption and inefficiency in government, and tragedies they are inevitable. Man versus nature is the tale as old as time. But at the same time, it does seem like in the United States and throughout the West, there's a level of decadence that's crept into our institutions and our infrastructure. And do you see, Chris, you were just getting to this point. That's what honestly is very scary to me, frightening to me. Do you see that in the response so far?
Yeah, you see it in every facet of society. Remember during COVID, there was this thing where people would say, don't tell me that you're going to do your own research. That made you a crazy person.
Right.
Not trusting what's just given to you, what's put in you, take this injection, take this spoonful, eat this medicine. Don't cross this red tape. The government's in charge. You're fine. People who still believe that are stupid. But a lot of people, or at least they're just not thinking. And a lot of people, I think, do fall into that trap, a surprising amount. And fortunately, we're actually not seeing that in Appalachia. That's why Mercury One and Glenn Beck and Blaze guys are down there with 100 helicopters. That's why the Florida National Guard is going in there every day. Some of our guys were embedded with them previously. That's why you see these incredible stories, just like the Cajun Navy and the Cajun Air Force, but you see an Appalachian version of it where they're going through with the donkeys and the horses and the four-wheelers, and they're getting water to people, they're getting electricity to people. Not electricity, they're getting supplies to people, they're getting vitamins, whatever they need, medicines.
My last question for you, Chris, is what you're hearing. I know you're overseeing coverage on the ground. You're DC correspondent and senior politics editor over at The Blaze, but you obviously, in your capacity as an editor, are seeing what's coming in from Blaze reporters who are on the ground across Appalachia. People lost power all the way up to Cincinnati. There's people who have suffered here in the Virginia area. So is there anything that just stands out from the coverage that you've been watching unfold over the last couple of weeks?
Two things that stand out to me that I think people really need to understand is the incredible frustration of the rescuers, the petty tyrants who are getting in their way, the red tape that is holding them back, and the fact that this is a race against time. I mean, we're a couple days in now. People without access to water, clean water, without access to information, are dying. And there's an incredible sense of frustration. And the second thing that is important, I think, to get across that my guys have been hearing and talking to me about is we're just beginning this process. It, as hellish as it seemed and as ghastly as these numbers have been, it is certainly going to get significantly worse. It's like the Johnstown flood or something. The tally for this will be counted for years as people are found and the true devastation really begins to unfold. So keep people, there's active rescue. This is an active rescue effort right now, an active operation that needs help, needs donations, needs volunteer time, needs support. But sooner, it's not too long from turning into a really long, slow, and sad dig for Remain. So keep people in your prayers.
Christopher Bedford, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. We are here every day. Please make sure to subscribe here to the Undercurrents channel, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and of course, over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. We'll see you back here tomorrow.